Hello and welcome to Good Drugs. I'm Michael Fiedler, PhD, and I'm of the belief that in order to get through this thing called life, we need potions, elixirs, magic pills, and it's just a matter of finding good ones. And the good drugs today are psychedelics. So I think this is finally the episode that most people were expecting when I first launched this. I appreciate those that sat through the first, I don't know, half dozen episodes, but I wanted to establish a sense of credibility before I got into things like this. So this was always a place I wanted to go, but I wanted to make sure that I had credibility scientifically before I could get to that point. So now let's talk about some fun stuff. So I want to start with a good point of entry, and I'll have links to all these things in the comment section. And I wanted to start with a man named Tim Ferriss, who's a podcast host, and he's done a lot of interesting things, wrote a lot of really good books. The first one I came across in 2009, I want to say, is The 4 Hour Work Week, which is sort of his life hack way of eliminating 90% of your work week. But suffice it to say that Tim is an interesting mouthpiece of truth. He has a lot of really interesting ideas that he brings forward. He's not doesn't draw a lot of attention to himself in terms of like his brand or his appearance, but more like the things that he executes. And he's a very intense guy. So, which is suffice to say that like I'm not a huge fan of him personally. I don't think he would really want that, but I'm a big fan of like the things that he brings forward, which are really diverse, not unlike the things I try to come up with. So and he has been on a psychedelic journey, which sounds kind of funny, but he's been trying to elevate the general competency around psychedelics and their use in various different therapeutic dimensions, which I'll get to later. But he had a really good podcast with a man named Michael Pollan. And Michael Pollan, similarly, is another diverse thinker who's been around the block in a number of different capacities. I think Tim calls him the consummate pollinator. I first came across him when he had a show on Netflix called Cooked, which I was really into about 4 or 5 years ago when my wife and I were experimenting in the kitchen a lot. And he is somewhat of a polarizing entity. I mean, he's in the Berkeley area, and anybody in that space is going to kind of turn on a lot of people, but also turn off a lot of others. So I can imagine that not everybody is in love with him, but he wrote a book on psychedelics that he talks about with Tim Ferriss, and it's a really good point of entry. And Pollan's a great storyteller. So for those that are curious to learn more, I think that's a really good place to start. There's also a fun, I don't know what to call it, a series, but a program on Netflix called Have a Good Trip that's really funny, and unpacks the psychedelic experiences of a lot of celebrities like Sarah Silverman, Will Forte. There's a bunch of other people that are in the movie. The guy from I can't think of his name right now, but there's a lot of really interesting celebrities in that series, and it's in that program, and it's fun. And I'll also have a link to that. But the thing that I think is really, and so what I intend to do with this episode, and those are sort of the points of entry that sort of anybody can appreciate. But what I want to do with this is talk about, what I think about varying psychedelics, and I'm going to go through sort of like three clusters. I'm going to start with the LSD psilocybin cluster. I'm going to talk a little bit about MDMA and ecstasy, and also a little bit about DMT and ayahuasca. So that's kind of the journey that I want to go on, and all of these things are mentioned in the various background. So some of these things are going to be their opinions and things I've learned from them. Some of them are going to be my own opinions based on things I've read, things I've experienced myself. And the thing that I think is the most profound about psychedelics, and it's not visuals, it's not seeing things that aren't there, because that's actually an underwhelming, at least in my own personal experience, an underwhelming component of psychedelics, but it's really the ego dissolution. And I use that term ego dissolution because that's how it's communicated in the scientific literature. And so the knowledge base around psychedelics is fractured. These things were developed at certain times, and then there was a lot of exploration and experimentation in sort of an above board way, and then they became sort of taboo, and then things kind of fell off, and then they've kind of been revived recently. So the research around psychedelics is a bit hodgepodge, but ego dissolution is a common thread. And what ego dissolution really is ability to sort of step out of yourself and to see a larger, bigger truth without your own personal bias. Things like self-preservation, things like making everything about you, you kind of eliminate that way of thinking, which isn't to say that you are free of it. Oh, sorry, you are free of it. You are not. You haven't like severed it. You just aren't encumbered by it. And the science behind that is getting to be pretty good. And the drug that I think is a good activator for that is LSD, which is lysergic acid diethylamide, which I probably could have said better. And that's a drug that probably gives a lot of people the shakes, very uncomfortable, especially if it's not something you've ever experienced firsthand. But what it's really done and shown to do is it affects the way that your brain, the traffic of thoughts in your brain. And it's very complicated, and it is, but I'll try to boil it down as simply as I can. There was a PNAS paper that came out not that long ago that was looking at fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging. And fMRI basically, if I'm not mistaken, shows where your body is consuming energy. So things like oxygen, things like sugar, when they're burned, they leave a signature. So using fMRI, they can kind of see where, and having probes for oxygen and glucose, they can see where the activity is, and they can kind of see what gets turned up or turned down. And what's interesting is that on LSD, what they found was that what's really turned off, or what really is muted, is your thalamus. And your thalamus plays a huge role in the cognition of the human brain. It is the center of the self, which makes sense in terms of ego dissolution, but it sort of like dulls the thalamus to some degree. And I think a neurologist that I worked with once described using the thalamus as like a train station. It's kind of where all your thoughts kind of go in and out of the thalamus, and it really kind of tones it down. So that's sort of bringing a sort of a physiologic, clinical lens to what ego dissolution really means. And LSD is known to do that. And so that's kind of exclusively why I think it's an interesting drug. In my own personal experience with it, I don't find visuals to be especially pronounced. They can be, if you're looking at this YouTube background that I have, you might see some like sort of oozing with the background. It might be like gyrating a little bit subtly, but nothing dramatic. As things, at least in my own personal experience, but that sense of dissolution, of that removing yourself from yourself, I guess, and seeing the world outside of your own personal bias is really, that's definitely something that LSD does and that I have experience with. And I think that that's really an important thing now, because as our technology has accelerated to the point of where we are today, our ego has been really empowered. 10,000 years ago, while we may have wants and needs, we were kind of at the whim of what we could scrounge up ourselves as cavemen and women. But now, with a phone, you are enabled to do anything, anytime, anywhere, and that ego is kind of, set loose completely. And it's something like ego dissolution really offers the mind a window into a world without them, and being like, yes, you may have a comment that you could make online that will draw the attention from somebody's post to you, so you can have the validation. But like, if you have the dissolution of self, can you just appreciate the value of whatever that person is saying or doing without your own personal input in it, or how you can make it about you? And that's why I think these things are really powerful, because then one can see things that are about them or not about them, can influence them, even if they don't especially care about them, and can kind of see a broader, bigger truth, which is why that sort of people kind of joke about feeling like one with nature and one with the grass and such, because you realize that your consciousness is just another dimension of the human experience, and it's an interesting view when you can remove it and just sort of see the innocence of everything, and the naturalness of everything, and that we are just our bodies and we are just chemicals. And ego dissolution really makes that crystalline in your mind in ways that it's hard to articulate just using words. And but LSD is also a really, really powerful drug. It's no joke. It has depending on how much you take, and it's funny because when you take LSD, you take it in the microgram range, which is really, 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 really small. And it's something that it can last, a trip can last something like 8 to 12 hours, depending on how much you take. And one of the things I've experienced in my own life is it can get your mind to be you can begin to see so much truth, and you can see so much reality around you that you never saw before, that in the long term, you can't ever unsee that. It's kind of like seeing something really traumatic. You just can't get the image out of your mind. You can't, I like to joke that the LSD experience is like getting put into a rocket and then getting shot into outer space and being able to see the world for the first time. And you can't unsee that. So, you're sort of stepping through a looking glass that even when the drug wears off, you still will carry the visions that you started with, or that occurred during the trip. And if you're in a strong state of mind and you're sort of in a, you're secure with who you are, and you're secure with your they call it the set and setting, who you're doing it with, what is in your immediate vicinity, it can be really positive because you're not distracted by reality or immediate needs or sort of whatever the present circumstances may be. But if it's done in a way that's not that well curated and you're in an environment that's not ideal, it can really send you on a bad course. And because you are at the whim of your surroundings, and if they're not positive, then your trip's not going to be positive, and that's why people can have really awful trips. And also because it will have a sense of, it will reveal dimensions of you that you maybe didn't want or didn't even know that were there. But in the short term, whether plus or minus, even in a good experience, what I found with it is that it's really hard to sleep afterwards because your mind is just so activated in some ways, even though I mentioned that the thalamus is turned down, but you just have seen so much that it can be really hard to sleep afterwards. So it can actually be even longer than an 8 to 12 experience. It can be like a 24-hour experience depending on what your come down is like. But what's interesting about sort of LSD, or what gives it some of these powers, is that it's chemically synthesized. It was discovered in the 40s with a guy who was experimenting with various fungus, and that's actually nature's psychedelic, which is psilocybin, which comes from magic mushrooms. That's the active ingredient. And psilocybin and LSD are cousins. And in my experience, I've also done mushrooms a few times, and they're also a really good time, and they really have a way of giving you a sense of who you are as a person. And in my own experience, like LSD, the visual experience was not really a main driver of how it all went down, but it was more about, once again, that sort of that ego dissolution, and sort of like seeing things in their innocence, with my innocence, kind of, if that's the best way I can describe it. But unlike LSD, or at least what I imagine, is that you can gain a kind of a tolerance to psilocybin, and if you do it a few times, it likely will lose its potency on you over time. And LSD doesn't seem to have that similar effect. The way that you take the two drugs are also a bit different. Psilocybin is usually like eaten and consumed. And what you'll notice afterwards is it takes about an hour to hit you, and you'll know that it's starting to take effect because your stomach will start to feel upset because it's sort of entering your small intestine, and that's kind of like when you start to feel it. Whereas LSD is taken in a tab that kind of goes under your tongue, and it's a sublingual situation. And so it doesn't really have that same degree of, it's sort of weird to have something in your mouth for 45 minutes and such, but it doesn't, it's just sort of consumed differently. But I find that those, that ego dissolution is really a really powerful concept in today's day and age, where we are so consumed with our own preservation, or our ego's preservation, to put it more specifically. And things like ego dissolution can really buck that and get one to transcend their own way of thinking in a way that's really pronounced and enduring. And that's why things like psilocybin and LSD have been attempted in really challenging situations like end of life. Like if you're approaching the end of your rope, there's probably very few words that are going to be able to articulate the gravity of that situation in a way that's meaningful, or has the effect to give you some sense of closure. And you could just get yourself annihilated by alcohol or heroin or whatever. But that's sort of just running away from the experience, not really leaning into it. But if one can appreciate the dissolution of self, they can imagine a life in a world where they're not part of it, but they can kind of still appreciate its value. And that can be very calming and peaceful, especially in those types of situations, if it be terminal cancer or even things like post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'll get into in a little bit. But I wanted to sort of move on from this class by just mentioning two other drugs, one called ayahuasca and one called DMT. And those are more your traditional hallucinogens. Those are ones that are really, they will likely have the same type of ego dissolution, but they're really going to pump up the visual experience in ways that I personally haven't seen with LSD and psilocybin. And I haven't tried ayahuasca. It's an intense commitment. It's something that's done in it's sort of the natural variant. It's sort of the psilocybin the magic mushroom analog, and it's something that's been derived in jungles of South America, and it's a really intense experience. You have to do, it takes an entire day to or even multiple days to kind of prepare the body, and it kind of comes in a soup thing, and it's really intense, both body and mind. People oftentimes throw up on it. It's a really brutal experience. But there is a refined version called DMT, which I have tried, and it's much more compressed. And DMT is taken kind of like you would crack. You kind of use essentially freebase it. You can take it differently, but that's essentially how it's done. It's like a powder. You put it in a spoon, you light it with a torch, and then it kind of smokes. Then you inhale the smoke. But it lasts a very short amount of time. And if you read the Wikipedia page on it, it's called the businessman's high, because it sort of comes on fast and it leaves fast. And that's primarily a driver of the visual psychedelic experience, sort of seeing things that aren't there. And so that's sort of, I mentioned those two just as sort of a difference between psilocybin and LSD. The next class of drugs that I wanted to talk about are in the Mdma Ecstasy realm. And the first thing that I want to do is talk about what the difference between MDMA and ecstasy are. And so MDMA is a drug that was actually developed first by Merck in 1912. It's interesting. So among the chemically derived drugs here, MDMA is one of the older ones, and it was initially used in psychotherapy, and it had its own value sort of in the first half of this century, or last century, I should say. And it gives you a very sort of ethereal, feel-good, empathetic feeling. Everything feels good, you're sort of content with everybody. It's a very calming, peaceful drug. But when you mention MDMA, your mind may go to ecstasy, and then it goes to things like raves and dancing. And that's sort of where the departure between the two of them are, because ecstasy is likely MDMA cut with something else, like an upper, likely something like an amphetamine, or like speed or cocaine, or things that will activate you physically. And the reason why I draw those two distinctions is that an MDMA user could just chill at home and have a conversation with friends, and maybe they stay up late, but they're not necessarily wanting to go out to the club to go dance the night away. They might, but that's sort of something that you would if you had an amphetamine in you too. And the thing that makes MDMA and ecstasy different also the day after is that those cutting agents are what's really going to bring the hangover. Things like dehydration, And so that's sort of just a chemical distinction, or at least a nomenclature distinction on the two drugs to kind of just separate out like what their intended uses are. Um, and the reason why I make that clear is that MDMA in isolation has been granted breakthrough status for treating things like major depression, and it's also being tried in post-traumatic stress disorder. So similar to the idea of ego dissolution with LSD and psilocybin for like an end-of-life situation, MDMA is being tried in people who are refractory to all kinds of treatment, but still need something. And if you're someone who has PTSD, who has, killed a child in war, something like MDMA could crack through your own what they call moral injury and kind of get you to live with yourself and to live with the realities of yourself and to have empathy for yourself and for others, if that's the situation. And so the concept of using it as a therapy is legit. It's not, a joke. And people see the value in it. And that's sort of the challenge with a lot of these things is that, they're very taboo, they're very mind expanding by definition, and they're not exactly safe. All of the ones that I mentioned can lead to really bad situations. I myself have never had really essentially a bad trip. I've had a few sleepless nights, as I mentioned, but nothing really horrific that I think scarred me negatively, but I've been around people who have. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you're opening doors that you didn't know were open before. And, one of the ways I like to describe psilocybin, for example, was that old rhyme when you were a kid of where you say, like, here's the church, here's the steeple, open your hands, and here's all the people. And you kind of do that little thing with your hands, and you kind of like, psilocybin lets you know who all your people are. And if you have individuals or parts of yourself that are locked away that you haven't dealt with, they're going to come out one way or another. And me personally, I've had plenty of soul searching, and I know the different dimensions, and I know where all my skeletons are. So these experiences can be really activating and help me see things that I didn't see before, because I can remove my own personal bias from my viewpoint. But if you're somebody who has baggage that you haven't dealt with, it's going to come to the surface one way or another. And that's what makes these things really can make these things really traumatizing. And also things like set and setting, as I mentioned before. If you're in the wrong environment, if you're around somebody who doesn't make you comfortable, or a stranger, or you're sort of in a place that maybe is reasonable at, when you're not on a psychedelic, but then you're put in a psychedelic, it can be really, traumatic. Like if you're in public, or if you're on a car, or if you're in a car or a train, or you're in an environment you can't control that's overstimulating, which can be a really really drive a lot of the negative psychosis. But as the podcast, if you watch the Tim Ferriss, Michael Pollan podcast, Pollan does a great job of articulating the value proposition of these things in a way that's far more complete than what I've just done here. But I kind of wanted to just put my own spin on it and finally like talk about what people thought I was probably going to talk about with this podcast. So I'm intentionally leaving the names of the drugs off, so that you'll actually have to listen to it to see what I'm referring to. But I hope you enjoyed it. And if you're interested in learning more about good drugs or whatever else I have to offer, feel free to subscribe to my channel.